Hi everyone, welcome back to Radio Night Crime. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. A deadly love triangle. When a person falls in love, they often become weaker, more vulnerable, and prone to idealizing the object of their affection. In such a state, it's difficult to critically assess the qualities of the beloved. Any negativity from their side is quickly justified, and clear problems or odd behaviors are simply ignored. Overwhelmed by feelings, we tend to overlook the shortcomings of our beloved. But if those feelings are not mutual, and the loved one is capable of deceit or criminal acts, the lover can find themselves in serious danger. Several years ago, the story of a young man named Diogo Gonçalves shook all of Portugal due to its cruelty and cold-bloodedness, with two young, fragile-looking girls with angelic appearances as the ruthless perpetrators. The deceased youth and his executioners were participants in a love triangle, but do not be too quick to blame Diogo. He was not romantically involved with the two girls, but became the victim of the schemes and greed of his charming colleague, whom he loved unrequitedly, and her lover. Now, let's carefully examine this complex case from the beginning to understand how quiet and modest beauties turned into cruel criminals, robbers, and carjackers, why the victim's body was found in pieces in various places, and how a serious and prudent young man failed to realize he was lured into a deadly trap. The story of Diogo Gonçalves. Diogo Gonçalves was born on July 17, 1999, in the picturesque resort town of Albufeira, located in the south of Portugal. He was the only child of a simple and relatively modest family. His parents ran a small souvenir shop, so their well-being depended directly on the season and the number of tourists visiting the town. Diogo grew up modest, polite, and friendly. He did well in school, was interested in computers from a young age, and dreamed of a career in programming. People spoke of him as an open, sociable young man with many friends, both in and outside of school. He disliked being alone, hence he always sought the company of family or friends. After finishing school, the young man enrolled in a computer academy, but since the education was quite expensive, he also took a part-time job at a fast food restaurant to help his parents and partially pay for his education. Diogo had already established himself as a hard-working and very reliable employee who could be counted on in every way. In early 2017, tragedy struck the Gonçalves family. The family head suffered a severe stroke which left him balancing on the brink of life and death for several weeks. When his condition stabilized, the man remained incapacitated for a long time and was under constant medical supervision. But misfortune does not come alone, and while the father fought for his life, his wife was struck by a car on her way to the hospital. The incident happened suddenly at a pedestrian crossing. As the woman reached the middle of the road, a car appeared out of nowhere at high speed, literally throwing her into the air and without even braking, sped away. The impact was so forceful that the victim was thrown a dozen meters, sustained an open head injury, and had no chance of survival. Medics arrived within minutes, but they could only declare her death. The driver responsible for the fatal accident was detained the next day, but despite the clear evidence of his guilt, a long and complicated legal battle ensued as the man had hired a lawyer. The unfortunate Diogo, not yet 18, was left completely alone. At that moment, his aunt, the sister of his father, arrived in Albufeira and offered to become the guardian of the teenager and to care for her bedridden brother. However, the relationship between the aunt and her nephew was far from perfect. The authoritative woman dictated her rules, which the young man greatly disliked, and as soon as he reached adulthood, he immediately moved to a rented apartment. Unrequited love. In 2018, a young software specialist was interning at one of the largest tourist spas in the region. His skills and abilities were highly regarded by the management, and he was offered a permanent position with a stable income. Additionally, the sociable, open, and friendly young man quickly integrated into the team and formed friendships with his colleagues. Diogo conscientiously performed his duties and was always ready to help others. At this spa center worked an attractive young woman named Maria Malvero, towards whom the new IT specialist developed tender feelings. He began to court her cautiously, but for the most part, the colleague ignored his advances. Nevertheless, she communicated with him willingly, accepted gifts, but responded to all date invitations with refusals or quickly changed the subject. Diogo unknowingly fell deeply in love with this petite, dark-haired beauty, who held a rather untraditional position as a security service employee. Maria combined strength and femininity. She was approachable yet unattainable, and the young man couldn't resist her. This was his first true love, which proved to be fateful for him. Maria, the complicated Maria Malvero, a year older than Diogo, was also a native of Albufera and came from a very modest family. She never knew her biological father, as he left when she was very young and subsequently showed no interest in her fate or provided financial support. Maria was raised by her mother and grandmother, but her grandmother passed away a few years ago, and her mother was diagnosed with a severe mental disorder and placed in a specialized clinic. From a young age, Maria understood that she could only rely on herself, and thus, she strived to make her way in life. She was seriously involved in sports from school, strong and physically developed, while maintaining a delicate and graceful appearance. In high school, she took up jiu-jitsu and even earned a blue belt. Malvero dreamed of a career in law enforcement, but due to her mother's mental condition, she was denied admission to the police academy, which greatly upset her. Instead, she underwent special training, becoming a professional security officer, and was accepted into the security department of the spa center. Maria's salary barely covered the essentials, as she had to pay for the treatment and care of her ailing mother, whose condition was deteriorating. Nonetheless, the young woman did not despair. She remained optimistic about the future and was kind and friendly with those around her. However, the infatuated Diogo misinterpreted her politeness as reciprocal interest. He even turned down a promising job offer in the capital because he hoped to win Maria's love and did not want to be away from her. The young man spent a third of his salary on his beloved, buying her gifts and taking her to restaurants and amusement parks. They soon appeared to be a happy couple, yet throughout their time together, Maria never once allowed him a kiss. However, as it turned out, her reserve was not due to excessive modesty or shyness. One day, Diogo stumbled upon a short video on social media where his beloved was hugging and kissing another girl. It turned out she had been in a romantic relationship with 23-year-old Mariana Finesco for over a year. Devastated, Diogo confronted Maria, asking why she had not been upfront with him, but she replied that she preferred to keep her personal life private. Despite such a revelation, Gonzalez continued his courtship, never giving up hope that one day she might reciprocate his love. The greed for easy gain Mariana Finesco also came from a humble background and received no financial support from her family. She graduated from a nursing college and worked as a basic nurse at a local hospital. She and Maria dreamed of renting a place together to live, but their modest incomes and the need to support their families made this impossible. In January 2020, when Diogo once again invited Maria to dinner at a restaurant, he mentioned that the court case against the driver who fatally struck his mother had just concluded. The driver was found guilty and ordered to pay a substantial compensation of 100,000 euros, which had been transferred to Diogo's account that very day. Diogo spoke about it dispassionately, even with sadness, as no amount of money could bring back his closest person, and he didn't notice Maria's eyes light up when she heard the news. From that moment, their relationship unexpectedly progressed to a new level for Diogo. Maria began showing interest in him and even tenderly held his hand during walks, something she had never done before. Goncalves couldn't believe his luck, feeling as though his deepest dream was coming true, but he did not ponder why this was happening or what caused such sudden and drastic changes in Maria's behavior. He simply enjoyed the moments, believing Maria's feelings for him were genuine. In reality, as soon as Malvero learned about the money Diogo had received, she shared the news with Finesco, and together they started planning how to seize these funds. Initially, they needed to make Diogo believe that Maria had finally noticed him as a man and reciprocated his affection. Then, the women planned to use either deceit or force to take the money from the young man and escape to another country, where they could start a new life with the funds. A romantic evening turns into a brutal encounter. One day, Maria approached Diogo unexpectedly and suggested spending a romantic evening together. She mentioned that perhaps their relationship could reach a new level, that they could become a couple, and that something might develop between them. At that moment, Diogo was truly happy, and the sudden changes in the girl's behavior did not alarm him. He believed in the sincerity of her feelings. The long-awaited meeting was set for the evening of Friday, March 20th, 2020 at Diogo's rented apartment. The young man himself prepared dinner, set a table for two, bought flowers and a small gift for his beloved. Maria arrived around 8 o'clock in the evening. They sat down at the table and she poured a fruit fresh that she had brought, urging Diogo to drink all of its contents to appreciate the taste of the beverage she had prepared. Without hesitation, he did so, unaware that the juice contained a high dose of a potent sedative that Mariana had obtained from her workplace. Soon, Diogo felt unwell. His head was spinning, everything before his eyes blurred, and he felt sleepy. He realized something was wrong and became very nervous, trying to reach his phone, but Maria snatched the device from his hands, saying she wanted to perform an erotic dance for him. She turned on the music, began to slowly undress, and the young man seemed to calm down a bit. Then, she tied him to a chair, presenting it as part of the game. At some point, Diogo panicked, tried to free himself, but fell to the floor along with the chair. Seeing Maria simply watching the events unfold, he began to scream and call for help, hoping that the neighbors could hear him. Then, she pressed on his neck, after which the young man lost consciousness. After this, she called Mariana, who had been waiting in a car parked nearby, ready for a signal. When Finesco entered the apartment, she saw Diogo lying on the floor and asked what had happened. Maria explained that the dosage of the drug had apparently been too small, and Diogo had not fallen asleep but started to panic and scream. The girls noticed that he was not breathing and decided to untie him, and Mariana, using her skills, began CPR. When Diogo regained consciousness, he again began to scream, tried to resist and ran out of the apartment, but Maria, using her martial arts skills, knocked him down and performed a chokehold. A few minutes later, Gonzalez showed no signs of life, and the friends did not attempt to revive him further. The imperfect crime using fingerprints and Face ID, the girls managed to unlock the deceased young man's phone and access his banking app. They transferred all his available funds to Maria's account, and then pondered how to dispose of the body to delay its discovery as long as possible. Knowing that Gonzalez was expected at work the next day, Malvero decided to send a message from his phone to his boss, requesting time off due to sudden family issues. This message surprised his boss, as during his tenure, the programmer had never asked for time off, been late, or swapped shifts. The boss tried to call the employee to find out what was happening, but all calls were rejected, followed by a message from Diogo, claiming he couldn't talk right now. On Saturday, still contemplating what to do with the body, the culprits went to a large shopping mall where they had stolen from the victim. Surveillance camera footage showed them behaving casually, making purchases, eating at the food court, and smiling as they chatted. They did not appear tense and clearly believed they could evade accountability. Returning to the apartment, the friends decided to sever Diogo's thumb so they could unlock his phone if needed to send messages on his behalf. It was at that moment they realized the best course would be to dismember the body and scatter it in various places, staging the young man's disappearance as if he had taken his own life. They bought plastic wrap and large trash bags, and using a kitchen cleaver and knives, separated the limbs and head from the torso. Mariana's knowledge of human anatomy proved quite useful during this gruesome task. The friends then packed all the parts into 4 bags, which they carried out of the apartment late at night, and loaded into the trunk of Diogo's car. Maria drove the car of her deceased admirer, followed by her accomplice in her own vehicle. They drove out of town to a cliff, where they dropped the bag containing the torso off the edge, leaving the car near the cliff to make it look as though the young man had jumped. However, they failed to notice that the body did not sink, but got stuck in a crevice at the base of the cliff. They then drove a few miles to a wooded slope, where they threw out the head and discarded the victim's limbs over a small waterfall. Body parts on the coast that Saturday, the management of the spa center reported the employee's disappearance to the police, mentioning the strange messages sent from his number. However, The search for the young man did not start until Sunday, a full day after the disappearance was reported. The first discovery was his car at the cliff's edge, and initially, it was presumed he had taken his own life. But just a few hours later, authorities found a torso in a bag in the crevice below, which was soon confirmed to be Gonçalves through forensic analysis. The same day, a group of tourists reported to the police that they had found a torn bag containing a human head. The limbs were only found several days later, after extensive searches involving divers. The crime scene was horrific, but according to colleagues and friends of the deceased, he had no enemies, was kind-hearted, never broke the law, and did not associate with people who had criminal records or were linked to criminal activities, but who then could have brutally taken the life of such a quiet and friendly young man. The investigation, arrest, and initial court decision. From the early stages of the investigation, it was discovered that the young man had recently received a significant amount of money in his account as compensation from a court decision. However, it was found that, mysteriously, this money had been transferred to Diogo's colleague, Maria. She was interrogated as she and Mariana were about to leave the country through the airport. Malvero was caught off guard. She did not expect the police to track them down within just a few days. She confessed immediately, claiming that she committed the crime because her colleague had pursued her and tried to coerce her into intimacy. She also asserted that she had planned and executed the crime on her own, insisting her partner had no involvement. Nonetheless, both women were detained and taken to the station to give their statements. Maria insisted that she had accidentally strangled the young man after he tried to force her into intimacy. However, Diogo's colleagues maintained that he would never treat a woman he liked in such a manner, a sentiment supported by the correspondence between the victim and the accused. Additionally, a high concentration of a potent sedative found in the victim's blood suggested that he was incapacitated at the time of his death. Maria then tried to take full responsibility again, claiming she had committed the crime for the money. She alleged that Mariana was unaware, and when the incident occurred, she even tried to perform CPR on the young man. Mariana, however, contended that they had planned the theft together, intending only to transfer the money to their account and then flee, but that things did not go as planned. There was no doubt about the guilt of the women, but determining their exact roles in the crime proved challenging. Both pleaded to be placed in the same jail during the investigation so they could at least see each other, but despite their requests, they were placed in separate detention facilities, denying them any communication or contact. The trial began in July 2020. Despite Malvero's persistent claims of sole responsibility, investigators doubted she acted alone, questioning how she could skillfully dismember a body without anatomical knowledge. A 6-month period was allotted for the investigation to gather all relevant circumstances, evidence, and testimony. Throughout this time, the suspects had no contact with each other, and the case took an unexpected turn. At a hearing in February 2021, when Maria again claimed full responsibility, Mariana simply confirmed her statements, declaring she had no involvement in the murder or robbery. Maria's lover's behavior seemingly dismayed her, and a month later, Malvero changed her initial testimony. She now claimed that she acted under Mariana's direction, who was the crime's mastermind, and noted that it was her friend who dismembered the body because she knew how to do it best. Maria added that she had initially taken the blame to protect her loved one, but realized that her friend had never truly loved her. Despite Malvero's altered testimony, in April 2021, the court found her guilty of premeditated murder, mutilation of a body, robbery, and carjacking. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Mariana, as an accomplice, received a 4-year sentence, but was released on parole in less than a year. The court believed her attempts to perform CPR indicated that she had not intended to take his life and wanted to help. A new trial and an unexpected twist. After being released, Mariana Finesco agreed to give an interview to a local TV channel, a decision that proved to be a grave mistake. During the interview, she placed all the blame on her already incarcerated friend, all the while smiling and appearing very self-satisfied. Shortly after the video became public, a well-known psychologist analyzed it, explaining how gestures, facial expressions, and body language can indicate deception. He suggested that Mariana was reveling in her impunity and sense of superiority, indicating she was a seed manipulator capable of shifting all blame onto someone else. A month after her release, Finesco sued the hospital where she had previously worked, claiming she had been wrongfully terminated and demanded a significant amount as moral compensation. Surprisingly, the court sided with her, ordering the hospital management to reinstate her and pay the compensation she sought. It seemed that everything was going exceptionally well for Mariana. She was free, back at her job, and had received 40,000 euros in moral compensation. However, news soon came from the prison that Maria had taken her own life by hanging herself with a bedsheet in her cell. She left behind a note detailing aspects of Diogo's perpetration that implicated her friend. Following this incident, the case was reopened, and the victim's father filed an appeal, insisting that Finesco was as guilty as her accomplice. The Supreme Court only delivered the final verdict in June 2023, finding Mariana guilty of planning and carrying out the murder of Gonzalez, as well as dismembering his body and carjacking. Ultimately, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of early release. Since then, she and her lawyer have attempted to file appeals twice, but so far all their appeals have been rejected. Story 2. On January 12, 2023, CBS News Minnesota aired a 24-second clip of the death of gray-haired old man Donald Blome. He died on January 10, 2023 at the age of 73 from natural causes consistent with age. But who was this old man who made it into the news summary? Donald Blome is a brutal maniac and criminal who served a life sentence in prison and despite his deeds died his death. Donald Blome's death brings to an end a long-running saga of violence and depravity that began in the 1970s and saw him commit a series of heinous crimes, culminating in the brutal murder of Kathy Poirier. Despite his long history of violence, Blome managed to evade justice for years until a chance encounter led to his capture and punishment. He began his crime spree in 1975 when he kidnapped a young girl. The pervert gagged her and took advantage of her, then locked her in the trunk of his car. But the girl was not timid and she managed to escape and later handed over to the police criminal. Blome was tried and found guilty, but the punishment was too lenient, and in 1978, when he was free, he again committed aggravated assault. In 1983, he was arrested for criminal sexual conduct. That same year, he threatened 2 young girls in a remote area with a knife, tied them to a tree and stuffed socks in their mouths. He choked and revived one of them several times and repeated that he was going to do something terrible to them. The girls were rescued when a police patrol saw their improperly parked car and responded quickly to find the owner. Blome then fled into the woods and later changed his appearance by dyeing his hair. He was arrested 2 months later when one of the girls recognized him. He pleaded guilty to the crime, but the newly received punishment did not reform him. During an examination in 1992, the psychologist concluded that without close supervision and monitoring, Blome would resume antisocial behavior in the near future. Antisocial behaviors are actions that are harmful or disregard the mental state of others, which is exactly the state the psychologist predicted Donald would be in. However, Blome managed to change his name, get a job, and get married. By May 1999, he had 6 felony convictions on his record, 5 of which involved kidnapping and violence. But who is Donald Blome, and where does the cruelty and desire to dominate others come from in an ordinary man? Let's get to the bottom of it, because perhaps the answer lies in the man's rather troubled early years. Donald Alban Blome was born on February 5, 1949 in the state of Minnesota. He was an American by nationality. Blome had a troubled childhood as he was often abused by his father from his early age until his teenage years. By then, Donald Blome was already drinking heavily and exhibiting behavioral problems, and in 10th grade he went to a reform school where he often skipped classes. The trauma of a violent relationship with his father is likely what led him to develop behavioral and alcohol problems. This was especially evident as he entered puberty. But let's take a closer look at this story through the eyes of a mentally healthy person and ponder where the chain of events that led to the man's disappearance broke down. On May 26, 1999, Caitlin Poirier was working the night shift alone at a convenience store at a service station. After midnight, a customer of the store called the police to report that the clerk was gone. Police officers who arrived on the scene found the store was indeed empty. They checked the surveillance video and saw a large man holding Katie by the neck lead her out of the store around 11:40 p.m. He was wearing jeans, a backwards baseball cap, and a New York Yankees jersey with the number 23 on the back. The fragile young woman was apparently forced out of the store. Catherine Honig, an employee of the Subway restaurant that was next to the store from which the girl disappeared, was questioned by police. She said that shortly before the Subway store closed around 10 p.m., she saw a man acting strangely. After closing, Honig drove home and coincidentally, she encountered the man who was leaving the store on the road. She noted that the stranger was driving a black Ford F-150 pickup truck with an extended cab with white markings on the side. The pickup truck looped around the maintenance area several times before entering Moose Lake and stopping in the parking lot of a local cafe. Honig also reported that Kathy's car was still in the parking lot when she left work. Based on her description and partially recovered surveillance camera footage, a rough sketch of the kidnapper was made. He had long blonde hair and appeared to be about 25 years old. A composite sketch was made from 4 witness statements and was broadcast on local television and placed in local newspapers asking for information. While clues were being gathered, hundreds of people arrived from across the state to help circle the wooded area around the station in search of the kidnapped Kathy Poirier. Police used service dogs and helicopters but found nothing. Posters of Kathy appeared in many newspapers and on billboards throughout the region, turning her story into a high-profile missing persons case. The local sex offender facility, which was located near the store where Katie went missing, reported that all inmates were accounted for. The information provided was accurate, which completely ruled out a kidnapping by a fugitive offender. Police officers began searching for the vehicle by license plate number and came up with Donald Blome, but unfortunately, the truck in his driveway was white in color. On June 6, 1999, the official search ended without success, but many volunteers continued to look for the girl. They believed that at least someone somewhere had seen something that would make the right connection and bring the girl home. Whether the perpetrator was brave or foolish for daring to take the girl out of a store equipped with a security camera, investigators were looking for at least one more mistake he would make. The searchers emphasized the neighborhood itself. After all, if the perpetrator was in this fairly remote area at night and returned to the store twice, it was likely that he knew the area very well, which meant that someone must have seen the man before the crime. A search headquarters was set up at the Lutheran Church in Moose Lake, with staff members assisting in processing leads and volunteers handing out flyers describing Katie. On the wall were maps with large crosses marking the areas that searchers had already traversed. But despite the efforts and hopes of many, Katie never turned up. Suggesting that the kidnapper might be an athlete or a fan of the New York Yankees team, the police sought the help of a sports figure. 2 weeks passed, but still no result. The police asked Minnesota Twins legend Paul Molitor to make a public service announcement. His appeal to Minnesotans across the state caught the attention of Darrell Brown, who worked at the Minnesota Veterans Home. On June 18th, he called the hotline to report his coworker Donald Hutchinson, who had recently stopped driving his black pickup truck and was described as looking like a composite sketch. He had been absent the day after the abduction and had recently gotten a haircut. Investigation revealed that Donald Hutchinson was actually Donald Blome and had a black pickup truck carefully hidden in his garage. He also owned property 12 miles from the store in Moose Lake where Kathy worked. During further digging, investigators learned that Blome had been convicted of sex crimes, specifically kidnapping petite young girls like Katie. Detectives worked quickly to get a search warrant. Agents from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension went looking for Blome and found him and his family at a campground 140 miles outside of Richfield. Agents woke him up early in the morning to ask him some questions. He was brought in for questioning. Further inspection revealed that Blome had purchased property in Moose Lake about 2 years ago. Neighbors confirmed that he had been there frequently before Katie's abduction but had not been there since. Blome's supervisor at the Veterans Home said he was unaware of the man's criminal record because he used the name Hutchinson. He said Blome always kept to himself and didn't socialize much with people. After his arrest, Donald Blome was friendly and cooperative, but then he refused to testify and asked for an attorney. Meanwhile, Authorities organized a series of searches that left them in shock. Various items were seized from Blom's home, but no official statement was given as to what the items were or how they figured in the investigation. Another search was conducted on Blom's 20-acre property in Moose Lake, involving more than 100 National Guard members and several hundred volunteers. They marched several miles from his property into the woods, but as darkness fell, they had to leave. The next morning, the search resumed with renewed vigor, and Katie's mother said she had a gut feeling that they would find her daughter alive. Apparently, some hoped the girl was being held somewhere against her will, but the sheriff was less optimistic. On the morning of the second day, searchers found bone-like fragments among the ashes in a fire pit on Donald Blom's property. They were sent to the lab for further testing, and to everyone's shock, they were identified as bone fragments, and a tooth found in the ashes was also sent to odontologists, experts in dental remains. Certified forensic dentist Dr. Ann Norlander conducted a time-consuming and expensive examination of the tooth. She knew that under the conditions under which it was extracted, any DNA that could have been extracted from the pulp of the tooth would have been destroyed, so she had to resort to other methods. When she came across something that looked like a filling, it confirmed that it was a human tooth and allowed her to determine if it could have belonged to Katie. Dental fillings are made up of an organic matrix and an inorganic filler. The organic matrix burns away, leaving behind particles of the filler. This allows the analyst to identify a brand or at least a group of brands. Manufacturers use as many as 50 different types of fillers, any one of which will show up vividly on dental x-rays. The composition of the filling of the tooth from Blom's fire pit matched the composition of the fillings used for Katie. In addition, researchers were able to identify it as tooth 18 and determine that it belonged to a young woman. The likelihood that it had once been in Kathy's mouth and not someone else from the area was quite high. One major question remains unanswered. Why did the perpetrator get out of prison after kidnapping 7 different girls? If the justice system had worked better, Katie might still be alive. Instead, Blom was able to change his name and shake off the stain of his criminal past, get a job, get married, and become a new identity as a cover to continue causing harm. In the case of Katie Poirier, Blom was charged with kidnapping and unlawful possession of a firearm, which is a federal charge. Given his prior convictions, Blom was not allowed to carry a firearm. He was offered a plea agreement, but he didn't want to even talk. But then he changed his mind and said he was willing to testify, with the condition that he call home. On September 8th, Blom made a tearful confession that lasted 2.5 hours. He said that on that day, May 26, 1999, he went fishing and then drove home to Richfield. Later that evening, however, he returned to his home on Moose Lake. On the way, he stopped to buy liquor and have a beer at a bar. He saw Kathy in the store while she was doing business. He did not know her, but grabbed her and forcibly put her in his pickup truck. He then drove her to his motorhome. I don't know if it was just out of guilt or something else, or because I felt stupid, he said, but then I strangled her and killed her. He strangled her from behind, saying it took about 20 minutes. He did not admit to any other type of assault. Once he knew she was dead, Blom placed her body in a fire pit, in the fetal position, and then gathered wood and paper to make it burn. But Blom's account clearly contradicted the video camera footage and the discovery in the burn pit. Blom claimed that he remembered her asking him several times to let her go, although she did not struggle with him until he began choking her on his property. He said he managed to kill her with his bare hands. His account of burning the remains was also not realistic enough, as wood and paper alone could not have reached a high enough temperature to turn a human body to ashes. When prodded, he admitted that none of this made much sense to him. He just didn't know why he did it. When the interview was over, Blom called 2 local television stations to report what he had done and asked that the reporters leave his family alone. The deal also returned confiscated property to his wife, Amy Blom, including a parcel of land on Moose Lake, a home in Richfield, and the family car. For the Poirier family, the confession was devastating because they had hoped Kathy was still alive. Blom now claimed that she had been murdered and cremated for no reason other than his nocturnal impulse, which he could not explain. Blom soon recanted, saying he made a false confession due to the stress of solitary confinement and the medication he was taking. He said he was hallucinating and believed the only way to escape from the cell was to tell the authorities what they wanted to hear. He was out of his mind, he now claimed, and didn't know what he was saying. The plea bargain had been canceled and lawyers for both sides were preparing for trial. There are different types of false confessions, and sometimes people just spontaneously confess to something they did not do. This usually happens in response to a high-profile case. Some people expect the interrogation to be too intense, so they quickly succumb to the pressure to confess, but there is another type of phenomenon that can occur. People may internalize assertions of guilt from the police and come to believe that they have committed a crime that they were not involved in. Whether Blom actually confessed to perjury or recanted his testimony is now for the jury to decide. Blom was brought to trial. The trial began in June 2000 and took 5 weeks for jury selection. The trial took another 5 weeks, during which more than 50 witnesses, including several key witnesses, were called to testify. The case was opened by Carleton County Assistant Prosecuting Attorney Thomas Pertler. Among the first witnesses, Blom's brother testified that he had given the family a box of old clothes, including a New York Yankees jersey. Blom had previously said he had never owned such a shirt. Even more damaging was the testimony of 2 women whom Blom kidnapped in 1983, who agreed to testify about how he treated them. The jury learned firsthand what he was capable of. Both women, being young girls at the time, looked like Kathy. Forensic odontologists then confirmed that the partial tooth matched Kathy's age, gender, and dental records. Dr. Ann Norlander admitted that at first she was not sure it was even a tooth. At the hearing, she testified that, with a reasonable degree of medical certainty, the tooth belonged to Kathy. It was the discovery of chemicals in the filling material that led her to that conclusion. A surveillance video from another store that captured Blom back in May showed that around the time of the kidnapping, his hair, now gray, had blonde tips as his barber confirmed, making him look younger. Most revealing was Blom's confession, which the judge allowed into evidence. Each juror was given a transcript for further review. Thereafter, there was silence in the courtroom, save for the quiet sobs of Kathy's relatives. The case against Blom seemed pretty strong at that point. Rodney Broden, lead defense attorney, called his first witness on August 7th. Amy Blom testified that her husband was home the night Katie disappeared. Speaking from the bench, she said she guessed where her husband was that day, because she saw a broadcast the next day about the girl's disappearance. She called attention to it because the location of her disappearance was near the country house they owned on Moose Lake, 110 miles from their home. Because Blom had a criminal record, she figured he would be a suspect, so she later realized exactly where he had been the night before. Blom returned home at 9:30 p.m., and they had already gone to bed. When his spouse woke up in the morning, coffee was ready, his spouse was home. She also testified that the police officers bullied her, threatening to take her children away if she didn't answer questions the way they wanted her to. They called me a liar, she said. She also denied that she had ever seen a baseball jersey in the clothes her son-in-law gave them, and said she had never seen her husband wear one. As she spoke, Blom wept, visibly wiping his eyes. On August 10th, Blom took the stand in his own defense. Under oath, he denied that he had kidnapped Kathy Poirier. He remained on the witness stand for more than 3 hours, alternately talking and crying. He claimed that his life was falling apart, and he felt ill at the time he admitted to the investigation that he had committed the crime. He added that his wife was threatening to leave his life due to media pressure, so he decided to do everything he could to free himself from the cell he was imprisoned in. He spent quite a bit of time trying to get the jury to feel sorry for him, as if he was the victim. He agreed that he had made a confession, but said he had also recanted it. He now claimed that he was not at Moose Lake the night of the crime, but rather he was sleeping at home with his wife, as she had told him. Although he had been fishing there earlier in the evening, he was home at 10 p.m., well before Katie was taken from the store. Later on cross-examination, Blom was forced to admit the lies and inconsistencies in his statements to the police at the beginning of the investigation, so appearing in court did him no good. To many, he appeared to be a winner trying to get away with it once again. When the questioning ended, Blom looked frustrated. He turned to the judge, cursed, and asked if he could only make one statement. After a negative answer, the case went to the jury. After 10 hours of deliberation, 3 of which were spent replaying the taped confessions, the jury found Donald Blom guilty. He received a life sentence without parole. Blom continued to insist that it wasn't over and predicted that one day he would be exonerated. "I never killed anyone," he insisted. He was sure he had a strong case for appeal. But in 2004, the appeals court issued an 81-page ruling that upheld the conviction. Although his trial was not perfect, the judges decided it had been fair. They saw no reason to overturn the ruling or order a new trial. The murder of Caitlin Poirier led to the passage of Katie's Law, which included the development of a statewide computerized crime-fighting network, tightening the requirements for tracking predatory sex offenders like Blom. Story 3. A Double Life. All world religions and nationalities have the same attitude to family values. A family is a home in which all its inhabitants should be comfortable, regardless of age and gender. Therefore, it should be built on love, respect, trust, and understanding. Family is the source of life. Parents, by their own example, instill in their children important postulates for the continuation of the family and traditions. Many people strive to create a strong and friendly family, in which there is a sense of community and harmony. But not everyone succeeds. Sometimes people creating a marriage enter into destructive relationships. These ties destroy not only them, but also those who are around. And they tend to be very vulnerable. Hollywood movies show perfect love, full of tenderness and sincerity. Beautiful and strong men literally carry their beloved women in their arms. But reality, as we know, is different from the picture on the screen. This story is about a terrible tragedy that happened in one Indian family. The happiness of one turned into misfortune for the other. Towards dreams. Jessica Patel was born on September 16, 1983. Her family lived in a Hindu community in Leeds, West Yorkshire, England. She was the eldest child, so she grew up diligent and obedient from childhood. The girl studied well, helped around the house. At the same time was cheerful, had a perky character. Jessica had many friends, but she especially emphasized Mitesh. The boy was 3 years older than her. Unlike her, he was modest and shy. The children often played with each other. As she grew up, the girl blossomed, becoming more and more beautiful. Like many other peers, she dreamed of falling in love with a worthy man to have a happy family with a bunch of kids, just like the heroes of her favorite movies. Nevertheless, the fantasies of the young beauty did not prevent her from being intelligent and purposeful. She wanted to be independent, to be established in life. Therefore, in 2002, she entered De Montfort University in Leicester. 4 years later, she continued studying pharmacy at the University of Manchester. There again, Jessica began to communicate with Mitesh, who by chance studied at the same faculty. While the young people did not see each other, the young man matured, became confident and handsome. Gradually, their friendship developed into romantic feelings. Mitesh showered the girl with compliments and gifts, was very attentive and caring. However, the bright streak was suddenly replaced by a dark one. Life presented a serious test for Jessica. Her mother died of an incurable disease. The grief-stricken daughter took the loss of a native person hard. Mitesh supported his beloved in everything, did not leave one with bad thoughts. During this time, the relationship of the couple became stronger. Once Jessica confessed to her sister that she finally found a reliable shoulder, it seemed that her boyfriend was perfect in everything. Happy marriage in 2008, Mitesh Patel asked the girl's father for permission to marry her, according to all Hindu rules. The father did not particularly like the candidacy of the future husband of his daughter. In addition, he believed that it is too early to marry. But Jessica tried to convince him otherwise, and in July 2009, their marriage took place. The ceremony was held in the garden of the parental home of the bride. Family life of the newlyweds seemed as beautiful as the wedding. Soon, however, Mitesh's behavior changed. He became aloof and cold. Jessica complained to her sisters that she began to feel lonely. In addition, the intimate life of the newlyweds left much to be desired. After the wedding, They did not have intimacy for about 10 months. All this was very upsetting for the young wife. She could not understand what happened to the former feelings, looking for a problem in herself. In 2010, Jessica graduated from university. Now she had the opportunity to start a career as a pharmacist. In short, live and be happy, prosperity, higher education, a beloved husband. Except that Mitesh's attitude deteriorated. The man became bossy and suspicious, controlled his wife's every move. In February, her family suffered another grief. Her grandfather fell ill. His health was deteriorating every day. The end was imminent. While the whole family spent the last days by his side, his beloved granddaughter visited him only rarely. Sister Manal later confessed that her husband did not allow Jessica to stay with her parents for a long time, and in general often go anywhere. On this ground between the spouses there was a conflict. The young woman did not understand what earned such distrust, which openly informed Mitesh. However, he became more angry and hit the unfortunate woman in the face. The young people came from traditional Indian families where the head of the family has the final say. So she had no choice but to obey the loneliness in marriage. One day Jessica shared her concerns with her family. She said that she suspected her spouse of cheating. According to her, every time Mitesh talked on the phone, he went to another room. Sometimes he did not go to bed until late at night, spending long periods of time alone. In 2012, the wife's assumptions were confirmed. She accidentally saw in her husband's phone love correspondence. Hoping to gain support, Jessica found nothing better than to tell about everything to Mitesh's cousin. They had communicated well earlier, so the young woman was counting on help or advice to save the family. However, Mitesh's brother brushed it off, making it clear that since her husband was cheating, it was all her own fault. This situation deprived Jessica of understanding from her husband's relatives. In parallel, he forbade her to seek comfort in the arms of her sisters. It was clear that Mitesh was hiding something. He was afraid to lose the authority and respect not only of his family but also of the local community. So he restricted his wife's communication in every possible way, hoping for a miracle. In 2014, Mitesh and Jessica moved to Linthorpe, a suburb of Middlesbrough, North Yorkshire, away from the family. The couple bought a spacious house with many rooms, made renovations. A year later, they rented a premises in which they opened their own pharmacy. Jessica believed that the move would be the beginning of a new life. Relations between them did become warmer. The only thing missing was children. During the 6 years of their life together, the woman could not get pregnant. Mitesh began to hint that if this did not happen, he would be forced to leave her. Therefore, in October 2015, she decided to resort to IVF. The first few attempts were not successful. The woman became nervous and increasingly depressed. Her condition was aggravated by taking hormones. In addition, instead of the expected care and warmth, Mitesh became distant again. He pretended to be a courteous husband only in public, and when he returned home, he would not let the phone out of his hands. He could snap. Nervous tension reached the limit, as a result of which the wife could not stand it, and suggested separation. She told her husband that she was disappointed in him and unhappy in the marriage. The man's response surprised her. He began to assure her that he loves her and in time everything will get better, and the best way to strengthen family ties will be a baby. Jessica believed his words. She had not heard anything like that for a long time, so after receiving a small portion of attention, she calmed down. Mitesh convinced her that he wanted children and a complete family, only did not tell her that for this he had assigned a special role to his spouse. On May 9, 2018, the Patel couple received great news. 3 embryos were successfully fertilized. Their transfer was scheduled for next month. This meant that soon, with the successful development of events, they would become parents. The future mom was over the moon. She was so happy that she hurried to tell her family about everything. Everyone was looking forward to the replenishment. Except that it did not happen. A few days later, Jessica was mysterious murder. On the evening of May 14, 2018, the emergency service received a call. The caller turned out to be Mitesh Patel, who found his wife's dead body wrapped in duct tape at home. Gasping with excitement, the man said that he left home to buy something to eat and to see the guys at work, to pick up his laptop. When he returned home, he found his house burglarized and his wife lying unconscious. Sobbing, he added that the woman's skin was very cold and dark marks could be seen on her neck. The dispatcher informed Patel that help was close at hand, with a police unit on its way. When officers arrived on scene, they found the woman's body on the living room floor. Her wrists and ankles were bound with duct tape and a bag from the grocery store was lying nearby. Unfortunately, there was nothing the paramedics could do to help. Jessica Patel was murdered. Investigators had to figure out what motivated such a brutal crime. The house was turned upside down and closet drawers were gutted. The criminals were clearly looking for something to eat, as they even ripped up the mattress of the couple's bed. Then jewelry and cash were discovered missing. Everything pointed to a robbery. Moreover, the husband of the murdered woman was convinced that the house had been broken into by robbers. In his statement, Mitesh said that on the unfortunate day he worked his morning shift, then worked out at the gym and came home. After work, his spouse returned around 7 p.m. The man volunteered to go get a pizza and left the house at 7:44 p.m. Thanks to a CCTV camera at a local pizzeria, it was possible to confirm his words. Captured Patel placing the order. He was friendly with the staff and had a relaxed demeanor. Before leaving the establishment, he called his wife to tell her that he would be back soon, but did not get through. On the way out, Mitesh decided to stop at a pharmacy, so he stayed longer than he had planned. At 8:50 p.m., he returned home and saw a horrible picture. Scattered belongings and a bound wife. Neighbors were no less shocked by what had happened. The neighborhood where the couple lived was considered one of the most prosperous and peaceful. Nothing criminal had ever happened in the neighborhood in its history. Jessica's autopsy revealed that the cause of death was strangulation. The attacker initially used a bag, after which he wielded his bare hands. Finally, probably to be sure of the victim's demise, he used an electrical cord as a ligature. Since no signs of forced entry were found, the investigation put forward an initial version. The victim knew the attacker and let him into the house herself. An inconsolable widower. As soon as Jessica's family learned about her death, her father along with her sisters immediately came to support her unhappy husband. No wonder, because in such terrible moments the family must stick together. They tried to comfort Mitesh as best they could. Despite the fact that the relationship between the spouses was not always simple, the relatives of the deceased embraced the inconsolable son-in-law and tried to find the right words. They themselves were in deep sorrow and agonized in conjecture. Who and why took away from the family favorite daughter, sister, and wife? However, the police seemed suspicious of the robbery, despite its apparent obviousness. After searching the house, the officers found some curious clues, thanks to which the criminal was soon apprehended and brought to trial. In the establishment of the truth also played a big role in the application on the victim's cell phone, monitoring the state of health of its owner. 3 days after Jessica's murder, the lead investigator in the case contacted the victim's father, who was still near Mitesh. The official asked the woman's relatives to return home so as not to interfere with the investigation. He promised to give more details later. In fact, detectives were about to detain the suspect in the case, Mitesh Patel. There were quite good reasons for his arrest. It turns out that during the search of the house was found a hard disk from a video surveillance camera, which was installed in front of the front door. The device was in a suitcase under the bed. It was later determined that someone had damaged it just a few minutes before the police arrived. The next find was a photograph hidden under the double bottom of the couple's nightstand. It shows Mitesh in an embrace with another man named Amit. In addition, footage from a camera installed in a house across the street showed that on May 14th, the only people who went in and out of the Patel family home were the couple themselves. The footage shows Mitesh returning at 3:30 in the afternoon and never leaving the house again. Jessica did arrive at the end of the workday, parked the car and entered the building at 7 p.m. The man then left for the pizza place at 7:44 p.m. and returned at 8:50 p.m. No one else but them was in the lens, which meant only one thing. Mitesh was the potential perpetrator, a mystery behind 7 seals. Patel became the prime suspect, but there was no direct evidence against him. So the detectives continued the investigation. During the investigation, the main secret was revealed, which Mitesh so carefully hid from family and friends. Jessica was right when she suspected her husband of cheating, but only it is not known for sure whether she guessed that her husband liked exclusively men. Apparently, marriage to a woman was necessary as a cover for the real orientation. The happiness of Jessica, who was by his side for many years, he cared the least. It turns out that 2 years after the wedding, Mitesh met Amit, but the latter, unlike him, did not hide his preferences, despite the fact that he was also a native of an Indian family. The men immediately liked each other and began to meet secretly. Leaving on a business trip, the exemplary-looking spouse spent time with his lover. In 2016, Amit left for Australia, but their romance continued. In the head of Mitesh, a terrible plan was born. Together with her lover, they wanted to not only start a family, but also become same-sex parents using Jessica's embryos and a surrogate. In his message, Patel revealed that the spouse was undergoing IVF. That's when he asked Amit if they will be together after that, to which Amit replied that it all depends on the outcome of the procedure. While communicating, Mitesh made it clear that sooner or later, there will come a time when there will be no obstacles in their relationship. In a recent message, he wrote, "Jessica's days are numbered." It was later revealed that the treacherous spouse was taking drugs that affected childbearing. All this he did in order not to have intimate relations with his wife. The investigation has established. Investigators were also able to reconstruct Mitesh's search history. The man's requests on the internet were strikingly eloquent. How to get rid of his wife, Hindu funeral, the procedure for obtaining insurance payments for the murder of a spouse. In fact, Jessica's life was insured for £2 million. After her death, her husband planned to cash in the insurance policy and use the proceeds to buy a property in Australia. In recent weeks, Patel had been searching for a suitable home. He wanted to create comfortable conditions for the new family and carefully prepared for it. During the study of the spouse's cell phones, in addition to the denunciatory correspondence, the investigators focused their attention on an application that counted the number of steps taken by the owner of the smartphone for the day. It was found that since 8:04 p.m., Jessica had not moved again. However, after 15 minutes, her phone had already recorded a movement of 14 steps. Apparently, these were her last movements or someone simply moved the device. As for Mitesh's activity, his phone showed high physical activity readings just prior to his wife's murder. His heart rate was higher than his typical rate. There were sudden ascents and descents of stairs between 7:44 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. Apparently, at this point, he was staging a burglary by throwing things around the house, and before calling 911, Patel went upstairs to hide evidence, a hard drive from a surveillance camera. In the safe of the pharmacy the couple owned, police found stolen jewelry and £25,000, as well as a couple of gold bars, all of which the widower said had gone missing from the house during the robbery. Also found there was a skein of duct tape similar to that used to wrap the victim's arms and legs. The torn end of the tape matched the one that was taken as evidence from Jessica's body. Apparently, it was with the goal of getting rid of the evidence that Mitesh stopped by work the evening after the pizza party. Although the man had been planning the crime for several years, he was extremely careless in his approach to the crime and left a mess everywhere. There was no doubt about his guilt. On top of that, the genetic examination of the material collected from under the fingernails of the murdered woman determined the DNA of the spouse. There were also scratch marks on Mitesh's neck, which he did not even try to hide, claiming that he had fallen. The trial and life afterward. Patel did not admit his guilt either during the investigation or the subsequent trial. He said that he did communicate with Amit, but everything that happened was a big coincidence. The trial of the accused lasted 3 weeks. The picture of what happened was established. The husband attacked his wife as soon as she entered the house. She fought back and scratched, but the forces were unequal. Mitesh had initially chosen a different method to kill his wife. A large dose of insulin was found in her blood, which could have been fatal, but much later than the perpetrator expected. An overdose of insulin causes coma and subsequent death. However, anything could have happened during this time. Eventually, the criminal's plan could have been thwarted. So Mitesh decided to finish Jessica off by putting a bag over her head. To make sure his wife was finally dead, he strangled her with his hands and then used a cord. As physical evidence, the prosecution showed empty ampoules that were found in Patel's laptop bag. It took him 20 minutes to take the life of a woman who had been by his side for years and shared the same shelter. The man showed incredible cruelty towards her. He then tied up his wife's hands and feet, making it look like a robbery. Afterward, he drove to the pizza place like nothing happened and even called her. Jessica's family could not believe what they heard. Both sides of the family were in complete shock. No one would listen or believe Jessica when she was looking for help and support. No one even stepped in to try to figure out what was going on in the family, except perhaps Jessica's sisters. But there was little they could do because they were in an unequal position. It took the jury 2 hours to reach a verdict. On December 5, 2018, the court sentenced Mitesh Patel to life in prison with a right to parole after 30 years. At the end, the judge voiced his thoughts that it doesn't look like the man has any remorse. In all likelihood, the only person Mitesh truly felt sorry for was himself. It is unlikely that the family will ever forgive the man for the sin he committed. They pray for Jessica every day and remember her. According to Hindu beliefs, her soul must be reborn. Since she suffered a lot in life and was unhappy, but remained a good person, in the next incarnation she will be rewarded. At least that is the comfort of her loved ones, who have nothing else to do but mourn and hope for a reunion after death. Story 4. Let's visit the small and picturesque town of Griffin, located in the state of Georgia, in the southeastern United States of America. Rightfully considered one of Georgia's oldest towns, Griffin was founded in 1840 and has since played a significant role in the state's history. All this influence of the past can be seen in its architecture and preserved monuments. The historical center of the town is imbued with the spirit of antiquity, where old brick buildings intertwine with modernity. Its rich history, stunning architecture, beautiful parks, and a variety of flavors make it a true gem of the South in the United States. Today, our story is full of intrigue and unexpected twists of fate, at the end of which, each of you will ask yourself one question. Where is the truth? Mary Catherine never thought that one careless act would lead to such terrible consequences. When the judge entered the courtroom, a special atmosphere of tension and anticipation appeared in the room. Everyone present focused and froze in anticipation of the verdict. The attorneys have done a tremendous amount of work, provided accurate arguments, and in case of an unexpected verdict, they already planned their performance and are ready for appeals and objections. The judge gives the floor to the jury and they announce their verdict. At the end of a week-long trial and a 4-hour jury deliberation, Mary Catherine was found not guilty and acquitted on all charges. But let's return to this joyful note to the origins of the story and try to understand together what led the young woman to the defendant's bench and whether it could have been prevented. Stephen Andrew Freeman was born on January 1, 1995, in Thomaston, Georgia, to Troy and Jennifer Freeman. He and his brother Blake grew up as happy, healthy children, without any problems with their parents or society. Kind and responsive, Stephen had many friends. Everyone described him as an exceptionally calm and balanced person. Stephen grew up in Griffin, where he later attended Spalding High School and Gordon State College to complete his education. Mary Catherine Higdon was also raised in a respectable family. Somewhat carefree, impetuous, humorous, friendly, she was drawn to creativity. She often put on many plays and performed them in front of her family and neighbors. Mary and Stephen fell in love with each other in their senior years and have been inseparable since. The young couple had a lot of common interests. Both loved being in nature. They went hiking, fishing, and even hunting together. In 2012, Stephen Freeman updated his Facebook status to say he was in a relationship and regularly posted various photos with his beloved. Mary's family was fond of her boyfriend. Stephen's parents, in turn, also accepted his girlfriend as their own daughter. After graduating from school, the young people moved in together. Stephen got a job as a plumber at Drainwright Gutters and Roofing Incorporated, and Mary Catherine worked as a teacher's assistant at St. George's Episcopal School. She also worked part-time as a salesperson at a gun store. By the summer of 2018, Stephen and Mary had been living together for 7 years, but had not gotten married. On August 1st, 2018, at 10:42 p.m., emergency services received an alarm call. The caller, 24-year-old Mary Catherine Higdon, screamed hysterically into the phone that she had accidentally shot her boyfriend. She reported grabbing a Glock 43 firearm, unaware that there was a bullet in the chamber. When paramedics and police arrived at Sunnybrook Drive, the girl was in a state of shock. She knelt in front of the motionless and bloodied body of the young man lying on the bed, crying incessantly, gasping and begging the doctors to help him. "Can't lose him. I can't lose him," she cried hoarsely. Law enforcement officers struggled to pull Mary Catherine away from the victim to examine him and provide first aid. 23-year-old Stephen Freeman, wounded in the chest just below the neck, was still breathing. He was immediately transported to Spalding Regional Hospital. Unfortunately, a few minutes before midnight, the young man's heart stopped. Not fully comprehending the tragedy that had occurred, and still in shock, Mary had to visit the police station to give her account of the events. She was called in for questioning, where the girl, still completely stunned, claimed that the shot was accidental. She explained that there had always been firearms in their home, and that Stephen would leave a pistol on the nightstand for self-defense before going to sleep, as their house was located outside the city. On that fateful evening, she merely wanted to hand Stephen the pistol, and it accidentally discharged. She had no idea the gun was loaded. Mary Catherine insisted that Stephen Freeman was the love of her life. She would never harm him, especially not intentionally. Examining the scene, investigators did not rule out the possibility that the act might have been premeditated, and they had substantial arguments to support this theory. There were signs of a struggle in the kitchen, with food and dishes scattered about. Detectives Adam Trammell and Chris Wilson found Mary's story improbable and continued the investigation, examining the evidence. Mary Catherine was called in for a second interrogation, where the investigators employed pressure tactics. They yelled at the suspect, expressed disbelief in her story, and demanded the truth. It worked. Mary Catherine confessed to shooting her boyfriend in anger. She shared that they had a severe argument, and she wanted to leave him. Having recorded the conversation, the investigators had an admission of guilt, indicating a case solved with a heartfelt confession. However, a serious technical problem arose, causing most of the recording to be lost, save for interference and indistinct noises. How this happened was unexplainable, as was the reason why no one thought to make a backup copy of this crucial piece of evidence. Further investigation revealed that the pistol could not have fired accidentally, as it required a trigger pull. Moreover, for the bullet to hit Stephen as it did, the pistol had to be pointed at the victim. Detectives also questioned Mary's behavior. Some suspected she was overacting, demonstrating her distress in an exaggerated manner. The detectives didn't stop for a moment, piecing together their version of the tragedy with new evidence and proof. Another critical fact cast doubt on the accident in Mary Catherine's words. Investigators learned that the girl worked at a gun store, where employees undergo thorough training on handling various firearms before starting work. This meant she undoubtedly knew how to safely hand over a pistol without causing harm. The picture of an accident didn't align with the new facts that the investigation uncovered. The woman changed her statement several times. Sometimes her hysterical state interrupted the interrogation, but she reiterated time and again that it was an accident. However, in another conversation, Mary Catherine let slip to the police that at Stephen's request, she tossed the pistol to hand it to him, and the weapon accidentally discharged. This didn't match what she told investigators at the scene and during the first interrogation. Back then, Mary repeatedly stated that she was simply handing Stephen the pistol hand to hand, not tossing it, and that's when it accidentally fired below his neck. These changing statements worked against Mary Catherine, as she was caught lying, and every word was scrutinized for hidden intent, indicating guilt concealment. Mary was detained and remained in Spalding County Jail during the trial. She was charged with felony murder, malice murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime. Lieutenant Wilson vehemently contested Mary's claim of it being an accident and tried to prove her guilt in a deliberate and meticulously planned act. A new piece of evidence in this case was common cooking grease found on the slide of the pistol. The slide also had lubricant, suggesting that at some point, the magazine must have been emptied. Bullets were loaded, inserted back into the pistol, and placed on a shelf. In her defense, Mary Catherine told the police that she indeed was preparing dinner for Stephen that evening, the very dinner that was found scattered on the kitchen floor, explaining the presence of grease on the slide. Subsequent interrogations of the couple's relatives and friends did not provide the clarity expected in this case. Many friends claimed that this teenage love turned into a roller coaster ride for Stephen and Mary until the very end. Their relationship, at times nearly ending, then reigniting with new passion, became genuinely complicated in recent years. The lovers often quarreled over emerging disagreements. Mary turned every argument into a drama. She screamed at Stephen and attacked him, after which he often left the house to spend the night with friends, turning off his phone as Mary continued to call and text him. She tried to control his every move, driving Stephen to frustration. The guy shared with friends that Mary, during arguments and fights, pointed the pistol at him or herself, threatening to end her life or his. Stephen never reported this to the police, fearing Mary would be jailed. And this was not the only instance when Mary resorted to using a weapon. And there were plenty of weapons in their home. During an interrogation, Stephen's friend Thomas Skinner shared that 2 days before the tragedy, on July 30th, 2018, Stephen and Mary Catherine exchanged warm messages, wishing each other a good day. The next day, July 31st, Stephen told his mother that he would not return home to that devil and stayed the night at Thomas's place. On August 1st, 2018, when Stephen didn't come home to sleep, Mary sent him hundreds of messages begging him to return. That evening, she prepared dinner and waited for her beloved. From Stephen's mother, she learned he was at his friend Thomas's place and went to pick him up. She encountered them on the road and, rolling down the window, shouted that she was waiting for him at home for dinner. Stephen replied that he was coming home. The evening, instead of a reconciliatory dinner, ended in tragedy. The police believed the case was closed as a premeditated act, driven by Mary Catherine's anger, but her defense team revealed another side to the young couple's life known to few. On June 17, 2019, almost a year after Stephen's death, his beloved Mary Catherine Higdon stood trial. Before the hearing, Mary Higdon was offered a plea deal for life imprisonment with the possibility of parole if she pled guilty. However, she refused the deal, insisting she could never harm Stephen because he was the love of her life. At the initial hearings, Mary Higdon defended herself vehemently. She repeatedly claimed it was an accident and that she loved Stephen Freeman. She also surprised many by accusing her boyfriend of abusive behavior towards her. She claimed he hit her twice and even forced himself on her. On the day of the tragedy, he allegedly attacked her and she had to defend herself. It turned out the couple's relationship had been deteriorating over some time. Friends and relatives claimed Mary Higdon was furious because Stephen often ignored her messages and calls. She demanded attention and pursued him, especially insistently lately. Allegedly, on the night of the act, when Stephen Freeman finally came home, he refused to eat the dinner Mary had prepared for him, which became the last straw for her. She couldn't hold back and fired at him. Prosecutor Kate Leonard stated in court that there was physical evidence supporting that Mary Catherine shot Stephen in anger after he didn't come home for dinner and ignored her calls and text messages. As physical evidence, the grease found on the pistol and the sheet taken from the mattress where Stephen lay bleeding were presented. The sheet was shown as a key piece of evidence that Stephen was not attacking Mary but was sitting still in one spot. Forensic experts examined the bloodstains and determined that at the moment of the shot, Stephen was not moving or approaching Mary Catherine but was calmly sitting on the bed. If he had been moving, blood would have been everywhere, not just in one corner of the sheet. This only confirmed that the accused version was once again false. In court, faced directly with the possibility of life imprisonment and finally believing in what was happening, Mary Catherine took a risky decision to give truthful testimony in court. With tears in her eyes in front of the judge and numerous attendees, she once again portrayed Stephen Freeman as a harsh and controlling tyrant, and with certain evidence, she managed to do so. The defense stuck to the self-defense narrative, presenting the argument that erupted into a scandal between Mary and Stephen on the evening of the tragedy where Mary fired at him in defense. Mary Catherine sorrowfully shared numerous stories from her life where Stephen had hurt her. She confessed he had repeatedly hit her face, shaken her, and threatened punishment for any minor misconduct or disobedience. Living with Stephen, I experienced all kinds of pressure imaginable. Verbal insults, physical attacks, and even assault. He constantly controlled and manipulated me. He needed to know where I was, who I was with, what I was doing, how I was spending money, and even what I was eating. He drove me to despair with unreasonable jealousy. I never reported him to the police because I loved and feared him. The defense presented ample evidence to support her claims, revealing not just text messages taken from Mary's old phone, but also a correspondence that raised significant questions about who was the real tyrant and betrayer in this relationship. The text messages, dating back over a year and a half between her and Stephen, not only proved the boy's harshness, but also the girl's infidelity. Some message snippets showed Stephen indeed insulting Mary Catherine with harsh words and threatening her with repercussions upon his return from fishing. However, the reason for his anger was much more disdainful. Stephen's friends confirmed that at that moment, he was indeed very angry with his girlfriend for being unfaithful, which Mary denied. Mary Catherine shared that Stephen had forced himself on her twice, and she feared he would hurt her again on August 1, 2018, leading her to act in self-defense. The defense called an expert and close relatives of Mary who could attest to the domestic violence. Mary's sister, Sarah Higdon, testified, affirmatively stating she saw bruises on Mary's arm 2 weeks before the shooting. She expressed regret for not photographing it and believing Mary's explanation that it happened accidentally. A tearful Mary Higdon explained to the jury that on that fateful night, she decided to break up with Stephen once and for all, telling him to leave the house. Stephen became angry and attacked her. In defense, she grabbed the pistol from the nightstand and accidentally fired. After Mary Catherine's emotional testimony, the prosecution and defense engaged in a fierce battle with Stephen's former friends, who had been close to Mary for years, desperately trying to idealize their deceased friend. Thomas Skinner, Stephen's best friend, described the victim as a loyal and hard-working country boy, and Mary Catherine as an obsessive and possessive girlfriend who constantly controlled and stalked him. He claimed Mary Catherine and Stephen's relationship had become toxic over the last few years, with her threatening to end her life whenever Stephen tried to leave her. And once, after an argument, she pointed a pistol at her head in front of him. Another witness, Stephen's co-worker Alicia Varela, testified that Mary Catherine obsessively called Stephen throughout the day, even when he was at work. However, in Mary's supposedly truthful court testimony, where she framed the shooting as self-defense, she missed an important detail that prosecutor Kate Leonard pointed out. Mary talked a lot about their interactions and how, after many years of perfect relations, they suddenly started to degrade and physically abuse each other, but she never mentioned the moment of supposed self-defense when she actually pulled the trigger. Prosecutor Kate Leonard was not convinced by such an admission, noting that in cross-examination, Mary never once mentioned any harsh treatment by Stephen. She repeatedly asked Mary Catherine whether a woman, being safe at home, would go after her assailant late at night to bring him back home. The answer was not convincing, and the prosecutor continued her statement, embodying that dreadful scene of the accidental shooting. Kate Leonard picked up the pistol and recreated the moment as she saw it. According to her version, Stephen came home. Then, after hearing Mary out, they argued, and he refused to have dinner. Mary, enraged, scattered the prepared food around the kitchen. Stephen, trying to avoid further conflict, went to the bedroom and sat on the bed. Likely he was waiting for her to calm down, but Mary, ready for confrontation, called out to him twice without receiving a response, walked into the bedroom, and shot him in the neck on the left side since he hadn't turned to face her. In her closing arguments, Kate Leonard reminded the jury of the various stories and versions that kept changing at every police interrogation and court hearing. Mary Catherine Higdon spared no details in her emotional testimony about the alleged abuse from Stephen Freeman. But before handing the case over to the jury, Kate Leonard desperately pleaded to consider this story not as a case of self-defense, but as a case of extreme manipulation. Despite the lost confession recording, the prosecution presented other evidence and counter-arguments. The forensic examination proved that Stephen Freeman was sitting on the bed at the moment of the shooting. Hence, he couldn't have been attacking Mary Higdon. Mary claimed they kept the gun in the house unloaded. Detectives suspected that the pistol was indeed loaded in advance on the evening of August 1, 2018, when Mary was preparing a roast for Stephen. This was the only explanation for how grease marks not only got on part of the slide but also inside the pistol. Had Mary Catherine really loaded the pistol in advance? Colleagues, neighbors, family, friends, and acquaintances of Stephen Freeman unanimously testified that he was not prone to aggression. Prosecutors also pointed out that Mary Catherine Higdon changed details of her story at least 10 times since the first interrogation, attributing such changes to fear. Mary Catherine refused a plea deal as she could have been facing the death penalty. The wait for the verdict felt like an eternity to her. After hearing all witnesses and the accused, the case was handed over to the jury. Just 10 minutes later, the jury was ready to announce their decision. However, 2 jurors out of 10 had doubts about some aspects of the prosecution's story. They were concerned that investigators, so eager to charge Mary Catherine with premeditated action, had not fully checked crucial facts. Questions were raised about the lack of a complete investigation into Stephen Freeman's phone, checking his text messages, and browsing history. The prosecution simply hadn't done this. Besides Mary's lies, no sufficient evidence was presented against her. The arguments presented by jurors Victor and Chris had an effect. The jury deliberated and returned a unanimous verdict: not guilty. A few hours later, Mary Catherine Higdon was free. After a lengthy deliberation, the 12 jurors concluded the following. On the first charge, malicious action, the defendant was found not guilty. On the second charge, serious action, the defendant was found not guilty. When the judge acquitted Mary Catherine Higdon on all charges, including intentional action, reckless action, assault with a deadly weapon, and carrying a weapon during the commission of a crime, many people in the courtroom were shocked. Watching the woman who took her son's life walk out of the courtroom, Jennifer Freeman could barely contain her anger towards the jurors. Everyone who supported Stephen's family was also stunned by such a verdict. After the trial ended in her favor, Mary Catherine returned home to be with her family in Griffin. Since then, she has stayed out of the limelight and is almost absent from social media, likely to avoid undue attention from the media and the public. Her Instagram profile is private, and no further details about her current whereabouts are known. It's assumed that Mary Catherine has moved on from her harrowing past to live a quiet and unnoticeable life. Stephen Freeman's mother dedicated a farewell post to her son on social media. Stephen lived a life filled with love, joy, compassion, and loyalty. Everyone was his friend, and those who enjoyed hunting and fishing with him were his closest. He had a heart of gold and a charming southern smile. Stephen showed his love for you by making you feel like you were the only person in the world, making you laugh until your stomach hurt, always smiling broadly, hugging you, and never leaving your side. These 3 simple words, "I love you," have always inspired me. So who really pulled the trigger in this story? That's a question you must answer for yourself, as all the answers in this story are evident. By analyzing and presenting the situation, it's up to everyone to decide whether Mary Catherine is guilty or if it was a tragic accident that cost a young man his life. How much do you agree with the 2 jurors who changed the course of a young woman's life, giving her a second chance? Mary Catherine likely lives a quiet life away from the spotlight now that she has managed to leave her terrible past behind. Story 5. Ohio is located within 2 geographic regions of the United States. Ohio is characterized by a humid continental climate with hot summers and cool winters. Precipitation falls fairly evenly throughout the year and heavy snowstorms are common in winter. Winter 2018 also saw snowfall and cold weather. On January 28, 2018 at 8 p.m. a car was parked outside an apartment complex. A young blonde-haired girl got out of the car and walked briskly toward the house. She was returning from work. In her hands, she had a bag of food from her favorite fast food restaurant and the keys to the apartment. As she approached the door, she was surprised to find that the key did not go into the lock. The girl hurriedly decided to check each key on her metal ring, but none of them fit the lock. Suddenly, she remembered that she had given her key to her brother and reopened her purse in search of a spare key. When the key was found and the lock was finally opened, an unfamiliar voice called her name, and she turned around. A large male figure grabbed her and carried her into the apartment with nonchalant assertiveness. The door slammed shut. On January 29, 2018, the staff of Shaw Davis Funeral Home was alarmed by the absence of everyone's favorite assistant Rachel at work. She did not answer the phone, which worried them because the girl was very responsible and took her work seriously. The head of the office asked a colleague who was engaged in delivery to come to Rachel's apartment to check on her and find out the reason for the silent absence. He went to the girl's apartment, but no one answered his knock or call. He contacted the manager of the apartment complex, but this attempt was unsuccessful as it was only possible to enter the apartment with the tenant's permission. Her colleague called the police to the place of residence of the missing girl. When they went inside, they found nothing scary. The apartment looked completely normal except for the leftover food on the table. Rachel, who adored order, couldn't leave food without putting it away in the refrigerator. This caught the attention of her coworker. He insisted on a more thorough inspection of the apartment in the presence of police officers. During the inspection of the bedroom, he tried to look in the closet, but when he wanted to open the door, he thought something was wrong. With effort, he yanked the closet door open and screamed. Hidden inside was Rachel's bloody body. Officer Frank Sclafani called forensics, and the apartment complex area was cordoned off. In her own apartment, Rachel Anderson's bound body was discovered in a bedroom closet. She was stripped to the waist, partially wrapped in a blanket. Her head was wrapped in a shirt, and a black article of clothing was tied around her neck with part of the fabric stuffed into her mouth as a gag. The victim was a young 24-year-old female, Rachel Anderson. Rachel Nicoletta Anderson was born on January 28, 1994 to William Bill Anderson and Patricia Trish Anderson in Warren, Ohio. Rachel had a younger brother, John, who was a common family favorite. She was a 2012 graduate of Warren Harding High School, where she was part of the National Honor Society and played soccer and volleyball. Rachel chose a completely unusual profession since childhood. She dreamed of becoming a funeral director. The girl studied at Youngstown State University, where she specialized in the study of the bodies of the dead. She treated her vocation with great importance, for which she got into the list of the best students and received a scholarship. She then attended Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science, where she graduated in 2016 with a Bachelor of Science in Mortuary Science. After becoming a member of the Ohio Funeral Directors Association, Rachel moved to Columbus, where she began her internship at Shaw Davis Funeral Home. She was very reverent about her work and felt it was her duty to support and assist the relatives of the deceased. Her internship was coming to an end, and Rachel dreamed of becoming a full-fledged employee of the Bureau, but her dreams of the future were destroyed and sneakily taken away in the most brutal way. Rachel's body was taken to the morgue, and investigators interviewed the first witnesses. The autopsy performed on Rachel Anderson's body revealed the mystery of the horrific manipulations she had endured that night. The young woman had been strangled and stabbed. She suffered a laceration to her scalp and fractures to the base of her skull. The stab wound went through the back of her neck and penetrated the left hemisphere of her brain. Rachel was stabbed with such force that part of her skull broke off. The autopsy also revealed that she had been strangled with an electric blanket cord, and as a result of the strangulation, she had hemorrhaged in her sternoclavicular muscles and eyelids, and the blood vessels in her eyes had filled with blood. In addition, forensic evidence showed that bruises and red marks on her ankles and wrists indicated that she was alive when the perpetrator tied her up. A DNA sample was found on the rope and on Rachel's body. The coroner who performed an autopsy on Rachel Anderson found that the death was caused by a stab wound to the head and neck, although the initial theory was strangulation. After interviewing several employees from Rachel's work, as well as her ex-boyfriend who had an alibi, police continued to look at different versions of the attack. Detectives returned to the victim's apartment to conduct searches in hopes of finding evidence or traces of the perpetrator that could unravel the case. On the living room floor, they found Rachel's purse, which was missing her wallet. The 9-inch steak knife used to stab Anderson was found by her mother 2 weeks after the crime in a box in her apartment. So detectives had their first theory, robbery, but such a brutal torture of the girl said that the perpetrator was not just a robber but a skilled maniac who took pleasure in the display of his power over the victim. Investigators considered different motives and for some time had no suspects, and the manner of the girl's death was not disclosed, maintaining the secrecy of the investigation. After some time, the investigation received DNA samples that were found on several parts of Rachel's body and at the crime scene itself, but unfortunately the obtained samples were not recognized by the database of special services. The obtained video from street surveillance cameras showed 2 people who used her car to drive around the city after Rachel's death. At that time, cash was withdrawn from the dead girl's debit and credit cards. Data obtained by the location service identified a phone number that was in Rachel Anderson's apartment from 7:59 p.m. to 9:25 p.m. on January 28, 2018. By examining the evidence, it became clear where the caller was at different times. Having identified the account from the phone number found, investigators were able to identify the suspect. He turned out to be 54-year-old Anthony Pardon, a recidivist, violent criminal, and rapist, whose criminal history before the murder of Rachel Anderson included several rapes, as well as robbery, kidnapping, and attempted murder. He spent a total of 33 years in prison for his crimes. The maniac had a hard fate. He was raised by his grandparents before he started living with his mother. As a child, the boy was diagnosed with conduct disorder and antisocial personality disorder due to social problems. In March 1979, Anthony, 14, was temporarily committed to the Ohio Youth Commission. In July of that year, he was placed in the custody of the court and temporarily transferred to Franklin County Children's Services. And as late as December, he was again found guilty of making threats and was transferred to the Ohio Youth Commission and placed in foster care. In 1980, Pardon was charged with abuse. The victim was the foster parent's son. Pardon, who was 15 years old when he committed the crime, was babysitting while his foster mother went grocery shopping. He told Columbus police he committed the crime because he was upset after an argument with his girlfriend. Anthony was convicted of the crime as a juvenile. On November 13, 1981, 16-year-old Pardon was allowed to the home of his girlfriend's 39-year-old mother to use the telephone. He pulled a butcher knife on her, took advantage of her, and stole $100 from her purse. He then bound her hands and feet, gagged her, and put her in the trunk of his car. He drove her to Valleydale, where he untied her feet and threw her into the river behind the Valleydale ballroom. When the perpetrator saw that the victim, who was partially clothed, was able to stay afloat, he waded into the creek and submerged her head underwater. The woman survived after the intervention of a random passerby who scared Anthony away. The boy then managed to get away before the police arrived and used the money he stole from the victim to buy tennis shoes and jogging uniforms. In May 1982, at age 17, he was convicted of other crimes in Franklin. He was sentenced to a term of imprisonment ranging from 5 to 25 years. While in prison, he committed several disciplinary offenses, including possession of a weapon, burning a mattress, and fighting. He eventually spent over 24 years in prison for his crimes and was released in November 2006. Upon gaining his freedom, Anthony Pardon moved to Georgia and applied for a job under an assumed name. But in 2007, he was charged with forgery and was again convicted in Floyd County, where he spent 9 years in prison. He was also given 20 years probation and was required to wear a GPS tracker on his ankle. In 2017, Pardon was released from prison, returning to Ohio in June of that year under an interstate agreement between Ohio and Georgia. He was monitored by the Adult Parole Authority and was required to check in with the Sheriff's Department every 90 days. The Ohio Adult Parole Authority did not provide him with a monitor, as requested by the judge, because of the length of supervision and cost concerns. Due to budget savings and careless negligence of state authorities, a former maniac and criminal was walking free again. So, on August 21, 2017, Pardon was caught with a girl of easy virtue in his car, and 6 days later, he was caught driving without a license. During that stop, he was found to be in possession of a kitchen knife and a shotgun. But again, either by some strange coincidence or police negligence, he was not arrested. The perpetrator's escapades continued. One of the CCTV footage shows Rachel's car stopped outside a store. A man got out of the car on the passenger side and headed into the store to store. The driver was not visible on the footage, which added some complications, but after visiting that store and interviewing the employees, the police managed to find out the man's identity. He turned out to be a local vagrant, Anthony Slits. A couple of days later, he was questioned at the station. He said that he was approached by a passing mature man and offered to cash in the cards of his ex-girlfriend. He agreed and thus became a co-conspirator in the Rachel Anderson case. Anthony Slits confirmed the identity of Anthony Pardon and outlined the entire route they took on the evening of January 28, 2018. In an attempt to cash out Rachel's stolen cards, the matter remained to be resolved. Find and apprehend Anthony Pardon. On February 9, 2018, a multi-day stakeout of Anthony Pardon's sister's house resulted in his apprehension. The 54-year-old repeat offender was charged with 9 counts, including aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder. On February 4, 2020, the protracted trial began. 4 witnesses testified on the first day, including Rachel's co-worker, Jonathan Kennedy, who discovered Anderson's body. Jonathan and the manager of her apartment complex also testified. The jury heard from Officer Frank Sclafani, who was in his car outside the apartment, when Kennedy discovered the girl's body and saw the surveillance tape. Rachel's brother, John, and Special Agent Joshua Durst testified on February 5th, and lead detective Art Hughes testified on February 6th. On February 6th, the inmate complained to the judge about his attorneys, saying he was not satisfied at all and asked for new attorneys. Recidivist Anthony Pardon was intentionally stalling. On Monday, February 10th, prosecutors brought in a latent print expert and other expert witnesses to explain how technology was used to identify where Rachel Anderson's debit card was used and at the crime scene. The defendant's sister also testified that he gave her Rachel's debit card, telling her that it was his girlfriend's card. Later, from television news reports, she learned that the card belonged to the crime victim. The last day of testimony was Tuesday, February 11th. The medical examiner testified that Pardon's DNA was found at the scene, while a forensic pathologist and a deputy coroner from the Franklin County office testified about Rachel Anderson's injuries. In the courtroom, a minute-by-minute picture of the last days of Rachel Anderson's life was reconstructed. On January 26th and 27th, 2018, Rachel celebrated her 24th birthday. On the 26th, her brother John traveled from Warren to Columbus to visit her. The next day, she traveled with her brother to the home of her friend and colleague, John Kennedy. There, the friends threw a party to celebrate Rachel's birthday. After a long party, Rachel and her brother spent the night at the house of friends, and the next day, the girl went from them to work, leaving the key to her apartment to her brother. On the 28th, John Anderson returned to his hometown and accidentally brought the key with him. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Rachel texted John Kennedy, who had a key to her house. She said she would come to his place and pick up the key. Rachel spoke to her mother around 6:30 p.m. and then went and got her key from Kennedy. Since her apartment door could only be locked from the outside with a key, Anderson had to leave it unlocked. She stopped for dinner at her favorite restaurant and pulled up in front of the house at about 7:30 p.m. She then left the apartment. Pardon was waiting for her outside the apartment. He abducted Rachel by taking her from the bottom floor to the top floor. He held her down with savage force while he bound her feet and ankles with a hair dryer cord, then tied her hands with a belt and blinds cords. When the victim was immobilized, he wrapped a curling iron cord between her wrists. To stop her from screaming, he gagged her. The villain forced Rachel Anderson to give him the PIN numbers to her cards. He tortured her and took advantage of her. He then strangled the girl in cold blood with a cord from an electric blanket. In addition to strangulation, the perpetrator also inflicted blunt force trauma and a stab wound to her head. He then carefully hid her body in a closet. He left her there naked below the waist and with the electric blanket cord tied around her neck and door handle. The perpetrator then stole her car, used all of her bank cards at several stores in Columbus for a quick profit. The defense did not call any witnesses. The final hearing was held on February 12th. Assistant Prosecutor Amy Van Koolen made the state's initial closing argument, constructing a chronology of the crime and telling the jury that Pardon massacred Rachel Anderson in cold blood. In defense closing argument, defendant's attorney Larry Thomas acknowledged that Pardon used the victim's cards but argued that he was not responsible for the crime. The attorney argued that the state's case was based on speculation and the DNA and cell phone evidence did not prove Pardon's involvement in the crime. The jury, made up of 4 men and 8 women, deliberated for about 6 hours over 2 days before finding him guilty on all counts. The prosecution sought the death penalty because he killed Rachel Anderson in an aggravated burglary because he had a prior conviction for a similar attempted murder of a woman. Prosecutors sought the death penalty instead of clemency because of his extensive criminal history. Prosecutor O'Brien said there are some people who basically cannot behave in accordance with the law and Anthony Pardon is one of them. The sentencing phase of the trial began on February 18th. A defense seeking to mitigate aggravating factors cited the suspect's troubled childhood to the court and jury. But that didn't work and prosecutors voiced that the aggravating circumstances outweighed any mitigating factors and furthermore it was proven at trial that Anthony Pardon was fully aware of what he was doing when he attacked Rachel. Pardon's mother and sister, along with a psychologist and his former elementary school teacher, did testify in his defense. On February 19th, Anthony Pardon self-reported a 13-minute unscripted statement to the jury discussing his abusive childhood. He also spoke about his problems after leaving prison, describing hardship and helplessness. He claimed that the system failed him and no one helped him. In his last statement, he blamed the justice system for who he is today. He did not speak directly about the crime or apologize for it during his statement. On February 20th, after 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury deadlocked on whether to recommend the death penalty and recommended life in prison without parole. Sentencing took place on March 16, 2020. Rachel Anderson's mother, Rachel Anderson, cried in court as the verdict was announced. The father issued a statement recounting his observations of the investigation over the past few years. He was extremely surprised at how a violent criminal and repeat offender made demands and became hysterical as if he was owed money. The man was shocked as a grown man complaining that the system had failed him, trying in every way possible to absolve himself of even the slightest bit of guilt. In his final statement, the father of the deceased noted that there is obviously blame to be placed on the system, but in the situation that happened, it only failed Rachel Anderson. Judge McIntosh sentenced Anthony Pardon to 1 life sentence without parole for aggravated murder and another life sentence without parole for violence. Anthony Pardon was also sentenced to an additional 63 years in prison for aggravated burglary, kidnapping and aggravated robbery and multiple violent offenses. The sentences must be served consecutively. An evil fate, it was the 24th birthday for Rachel Anderson. The life of a young woman who had everything ahead of her was cut short. Her internship was coming to an end and she was about to be offered a promising job. Rachel was buried at Pine View Memorial Park. Her family and friends are having a difficult time recovering from such a sudden loss. Each year, on January 28th, her loved ones light a candle in their homes and remember the blonde-haired, smiling Rachel. After all, to know Rachel meant to love Rachel. She was just a beautiful soul and she would do anything for any of her friends. Rachel had many hobbies throughout her life. First and foremost was her career. She had the gift of compassion. She loved dancing and socializing with family and friends. She loved children. She loved her life that was stolen from her. Story 6. The Price of Kindness. Did you know that along with criminology, the science of crime, there is also victimology? This is a field of study that is at the intersection of criminology, psychology, and sociology and deals with the study of crime victims. It turns out that there are certain predispositions of people to have a crime committed against them. These factors include social status, life experiences, and of course, psychological characteristics. The worse the social conditions of life, the higher the risk of becoming a victim. At the same time, the higher the social status, the greater the chances of encountering fraud, extortion, and kidnapping. As far as personal experience is concerned, it is simple. People who know how to deal with their surroundings, circumstances are safer, unlike others. Personality traits are probably the defining condition in this list. What kind of character a person possesses determines his or her life position and, consequently, victimization. The case that happened in 1995 in New York is about sacrifice and openness to the world, which became fatal for 21-year-old Kimberly Antonakis. The heroine of today's story is a beautiful girl with a good heart, who could not have imagined, even in a terrible dream, what horror life has prepared her. Thomas Antonakis, a successful businessman and a wonderful father, learned about the disappearance of his daughter from her colleagues. The girl's co-workers contacted him when Kimberly failed to show up for work on the first spring day. She was very punctual and was in good standing with management, so her absence was considered a bad sign. And they were right. The assumption that the employee was ill was dispelled. The worried father also said that he had not been able to call Kim since last night and had a premonition of trouble. His girl was always in touch because he made her a rare and expensive gift for those times. A cell phone, but she didn't answer the phone. So the man was forced to contact her friends. However, they did not help him. No one has seen Kimberly since she left the party in the early morning hours of March 1st. The grieving father decided not to wait and went to the police. Only after learning that the young woman was wanted, law enforcement officials suggested waiting at least 24 hours. It is quite possible that she spent the night at someone's house and will soon make herself known. She was already an adult and could do what she wanted. This attitude to the case did not satisfy Thomas, so he organized his own investigation. Remarkably, but the light on the story of Kimberly's disappearance was shed by a psychic. A person with supernatural abilities was approached by the girl's mother. The woman flew from Florida as soon as she learned about what had happened. In despair, on the advice of a friend, she decided to use all possibilities. Psychic at the sight of the photo of Kim reported that she is still alive, but very weak and dehydrated. She also said that the girl was kidnapped by acquaintances and tried to escape more than once. Finally, she added that the deadly danger comes from several people, and the name of one of them begins with the letter J. Apparently, this is the ringleader of the gang. This information was later made public and caused not only a public outcry, but also unavoidable consequences. However, let's start at the beginning. Kimberly was born in 1974 in New York, USA. She was the only child in the family. Despite the fact that the girl grew up in love and affluence, she was not pampered. Her parents came from simple families. Nevertheless, her father Thomas managed to achieve considerable heights. He created his own company which was engaged in computers. Earned funds, the man was happy to spend on his favorite daughter and her desires. When Kim was a little girl, the couple Antonakis divorced. The child was left to live with his mother. However, this did not weaken the connection between the little girl and her father. He took her on weekends and spent all his free time with her. When Kimberly's mother found a new man and decided to move to Florida, the girl faced a choice: to stay with her mother or with her father. Since she did not want to move and with her dad felt as wonderful as with her mom, the young lady preferred to live in familiar conditions. So Kim began living with her father, with whom she was very close. She grew up a well-mannered and sociable child. Over the years, she became a bright beauty. Her dazzling smile always lifted her spirits. And in general, she was distinguished by a sense of humor and positivity. Since childhood, she was surrounded by care, protected from trouble. Therefore, Kimberly saw only good in all people. Immediate problems bypassed her, in connection with which she was only heard about the dark side of life. Unfortunately, an open and kind soul brings a lot of sorrows to its owner. In 1994, the girl became a student at the College of Staten Island. A little later, she informed her father that she felt old enough to live independently. Undoubtedly, Mr. Antonikos was concerned about her decision, but respected it and decided not to oppose it. Then he promised himself to secure her separate living arrangements as much as possible. Therefore, Thomas purchased a nice apartment for his daughter in an affluent area of the city. He even equipped his daughter's dwelling with an alarm system. Not wanting her to park far from home, the man bought a space in the garage across the street. And to keep her in constant communication, she had a cell phone and a pager. Everything that was up to the father he did to the highest standard. His concern for Kim's had good reason. It had to do with his affluence and the girl's little worldly experience. Kimberly not only did well in school, but also worked part-time. She refused her father's offer to continue the family business because she wanted to find her own way. So Kimberly took a part-time job as an accountant at a successful firm. At this time, she lived an ordinary student life, often entertained, attended parties. Her father repeatedly offered to return, but she refused. Her desire to be independent led to an unexpected denouement. In early 1995, Kimberly sheltered in her home friend Liz Pace and her family. Their apartment was being renovated. Out of the kindness of her heart, Kimberly offered her spacious lodging. The young people had fun. They cooked together and spent evenings together. On one such day, Kimberly and her friend decided to go to a party. The girls put on makeup, did their hair and picked out suitable outfits, after which they went to the party. According to Liz, they had a good time. They had fun and danced. Afterwards, Kimberly drove them home in her white 1994 Honda Accord. However, she did not go up to the apartment, citing unfinished business. The girls embraced and never saw each other again. The first place Mr. Antonakis went to after the police was the parking lot next to his daughter's house. However, the car was missing from the garage. On the floor near the wall, the man noticed a shiny object. It turned out to be a small gold earring. The father remembered that he had given his daughter similar ones, and just in case he took them with him. Kimberly wasn't in the apartment either. He only came across guests, a friend, her boyfriend Joshua Torres, and their joint 2-year-old child. Thomas was aware of the decision, but was not in favor of it. The tenants were also surprised by the absence of the hostess and worried about her. Joshua reported that he was looking for Kimberly and volunteered to help. Later, Thomas came to the police station again. He stated that his daughter had had an accident, but the officers remained adamant. The unhappy father decided to communicate again with Liz, who was the last person to see Kim. The man showed the found jewelry. The girl confirmed that she had seen those earrings on Kim the night of the disappearance. Next, Mr. Antonakis visited the places where his daughter often went. There he talked to many people but did not learn anything important. Joshua, in turn, offered to look not only for Kimberly, but also for the car, which was very conspicuous. Then Thomas went to the police for the third time. This time he was determined. Therefore, he informed the law enforcement officers that he would not go anywhere until they went on a search. One of the detectives responded to the appeal of the agitated father. He said that despite the protocol, he would take up the investigation. The first thing he did was to reconstruct the events of February 28. Ms. Antonakis went to college in the morning, then to work afterward. After working a few hours, she came home. There, together with friends, she had dinner and then attended a party with Liz. Around 4 a.m., the girls arrived home. After that, Kim went to the parking lot. What urgent business she had at such an early time, it was not possible to find out. In the apartment and garage of the missing was searched, but no evidence or traces indicating a struggle were found. No foreign fingerprints were found either. Either someone made an effort to clean them, or the intruder acted with gloves. The car and driver seemed to have vanished without a trace. The only concern was the earring that was found. The girl's bank account was also analyzed. It was found that the last time she used the bank card was the evening before her disappearance. Therefore, the theory of running away from home was ruled out. The detective's theory was that Kimberly had been kidnapped. At this point, other police officers joined the investigation. For lack of other solid leads, law enforcement unofficially adhered to the information that Mrs. Antonakis received from the psychic. By the way, it is not uncommon for authorities to cooperate with people who have psychic abilities. Sometimes such involvement has positive results, but it is simply not publicized en masse. Witness interviews followed. The first people interviewed were Liz and Joshua. Officers learned that 65 calls had been made from Kimberly's landline on the morning of March 1st. This surprised detectives. However, Joshua explained that he had been calling all of his friends and acquaintances, hoping to figure out where Kim had gone and why she hadn't spent the night at home. According to him, she was like a little sister to him. Thanks to Liz's testimony, it was possible to determine what clothes Kim was wearing. A portrait was drawn up, which was to be published. A distinctive note on the girl's body were tattoos. One of them was in the form of a scorpion, her zodiac sign. The other was located on the waist and represented an infinity sign in the form of two naked people. In parallel, there was a search for the missing car. Were checked all the scrap metal collection points, as well as other places where the vehicle could be in order to disassemble for parts or sale. However, there was no positive result. A check of the girl's cell phone was also unsuccessful. Police officers told Thomas that he should have paid attention to the letters and phone calls he was receiving, as his daughter's kidnappers could have contacted him and offered a ransom. However, the Antonakis family remained in limbo until March 4th. Around 2 a.m., emergency services received a report of a fire. A large abandoned house was burning at 86 Woodhaven Avenue in Queens. Several fire crews were involved in putting it out. When the fire was finally extinguished, a charred body was found in the basement of the building. Forensic experts found out that the deceased was a woman of 25 years old. On her head survived a part of black long hair. There were also traces of tape. The poor woman's legs were bound and her hands were tied behind her back. However, the worst part of the story was something else. She was alive at the time of the fire, as evidenced by her smoke-filled lungs. In fact, the young woman was burned alive. Detectives hypothesized that the body found belonged to the missing Kimberly. However, dental records were needed for a full identification. At the same time, the ashes were inspected. The smell of gasoline could also be smelled in the air. It was obvious that the house had been set on fire. Apparently, someone had decided to destroy evidence of a serious crime, and indeed there were no traces except for the charred body. Examining the charred corpse, the specialists also found tattoos matching the description of the missing woman. The records that came from the dental clinic confirmed the suspicions of the investigation. That's how Kimberly Antonakis' body was found. Later, other circumstances of the case became known. One of the eyewitnesses of the fire reported that he often walked with his dog. However, the pet had been behaving strangely in recent days. It was nervous and barked at the house. It was unclear what could have caused this reaction. After the fire and the discovery of the body, it became clear what so attracted the attention of the dog. The girl tried to free herself and called for help. With its acute hearing, the dog heard the sounds coming from the basement while they were inaccessible to human perception. When the officers questioned the owner, it turned out that he had visited the building more than once in recent days. The fact is that he put the house for sale and monitored its condition and also picked up the mail and receipts. However, the man did not look into the basement, inspecting the house only from the outside. As the homeowner admitted, he never heard the suspicious noise, otherwise he would have paid attention to it. The man was clearly shocked by what happened. The investigators decided to question Joshua again, something they didn't like about the guy. In addition, by a strange coincidence, his name began with the letter J. This time, Joshua talked about the guy he hadn't reached the day Kimberly disappeared. It was a young man nicknamed Psycho, a Russian national, who had once dated Kimberly. Detectives decided to verify the information. They determined that the Russian had moved to the United States with his parents as a young child. Having grown up, he became a member of a gang and repeatedly broke the law. So, in the case appeared the first suspect who was soon detained. During the interrogation, Psycho became aware of the death of a former lover. However, his reaction shocked the detectives. The young man did not just claim that he was not involved in the crime, he was heartbroken. It was clear that he was experiencing genuine emotions. Investigators also wanted to see how he would behave at a crime scene, so they took him to the scene of the tragedy. There, everyone was convinced that they had the wrong man in custody. In addition, after some time, the guy's alibi was confirmed. Once again, the investigation was deadlocked. The victim's family decided to turn to the psychic once again. This time, the psychic said that she saw 4 people involved in the crime. She also said that the kidnappers wanted to establish contact, but they failed to do so. Allegedly, the kidnapping itself did not initially suggest a sad ending. The denouement is coming soon, the fortune teller summarized. A couple days later, hoping to get some information, the missing woman's father announced a $10,000 reward to anyone who would help catch the culprit. Mr. Antonakis could not forget the words spoken by the clairvoyant. If he had been told earlier that he would rely on some fortune tellers and soothsayers, he would never have believed it. But grief makes a man suggestible. The man went over in his mind her words about her daughter's kidnappers wanting to get in touch. What did that mean and what prevented them? Then he returned home and sat down at the table. He stared at his phone for a long time as he suddenly remembered a minor point. On the day Kimberly disappeared, he had listened to all the answering machine recordings as he had been expecting his girl to contact him. However, there had been no voicemails except perhaps 2 blank ones. When he turned them on, he heard nothing. There was dead silence on the other end of the handset, so he mistook them for some sort of device malfunction or communication problems. However, it later turned out that this was not the case. 5 days after the girl's body was discovered, officers managed to locate her car. It was parked in a fairly quiet area of town, not far from the crime scene. The investigation hoped to find fingerprints in the car. However, the vehicle was well washed. The only evidence was Kimberly's hair and a second earring in the passenger compartment. It seemed like a breakthrough in the investigation, but it did not happen. At the same time, Kimberly's father was being implicated in a local mob hit. Allegedly, such a rich and successful man was clearly connected with the criminal world. Some of the man's entourage even blamed him for the death of his daughter, as if his dark deeds had brought trouble on his daughter. The grief-stricken father denied any involvement. Detectives, through their own channels, managed to verify the information floating around. It was not confirmed. Thomas was clean and conducted his business openly. In July 1995, a young man was arrested by the police in a New York City home for burglary. Unexpectedly, he provided information concerning the case of Ms. Antonakis. The detainee claimed that he had heard from an acquaintance that his friends had kidnapped and then burned the girl. When the officers heard the name of the unidentified man, the picture of the crime finally emerged. It was none other than Joshua Torres, the same guy who lived in Kimberly's apartment and helped in the search for her. Detectives decided to take a closer look at him. The man was called back in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the crime. However, during a long conversation, he gave himself away. Torres said that if he had been the kidnapper, he would have fed Kim. Detectives latched onto that line because there was no coverage of the victim dying of hunger, thirst, or cold. No one outside the investigation knew that, not even her father. However, they needed more evidence, and it didn't take them long. Officers looked into the identity of the new suspect. It was found that the guy had a criminal record and was repeatedly attracted. In addition, he did not work anywhere and lived at the expense of his roommate Liz. While the girl worked, he took care of the child. Having free time allowed him to plan the crime in peace. He knew Kimberly's routine could track her down and hide her in an abandoned house. Then why didn't he demand a ransom? Something must have gone wrong, so the unsub got rid of Kim. The calls Torres made that morning were analyzed. It became obvious that the guy was lying when he said he was calling Kimberly's contacts. Most of the numbers belonged to random people with no connection to Kimberly. After examining his pager data, it was discovered that the guy had some strange messages on March 1st. The ring around Joshua was gradually closing. He had been suspicious to detectives for a long time. Finally, they got solid leads to apprehend him. They admitted to him that they no longer considered Kimberly's ex-boyfriend a suspect. And once again, they pressed the case intelligently. That's when Torres said he suspected his friends of massacring the girl. He pleaded guilty to accessory to kidnapping. At the same time, He said that he did not think that his comrades would eventually decide to get rid of a common friend. According to him, they just wanted to get the ransom and then let the victim go. But the plan didn't work. The kidnappers wondered why their calls went ignored by Mr. Antonikos. It turns out that they did make contact with Kimberly's father and even recorded a message to ransom her. However, the recording of the conversation was not saved on the answering machine for some reason. The kidnappers were angered by the father's inaction and decided to wait for further developments in the case. It turns out that they were frightened not only by the publicity, but also by the words of the clairvoyant that the suspect's name begins with the letter J. This information was not only published in the media, but also broadcast on TV with reference to an additional unofficial source of information. It's a mystical, vicious circle. One action spawned another. After speaking with the police, Joshua was released on bail and then disappeared. At the same time, his accomplice Jose was shot in the back of the head while walking with his wife. His wife later admitted to investigators that her husband did not trust Joshua, used a tape recorder when talking to him, and wanted to expose him. She claimed he felt guilty about kidnapping Kimberly, but he didn't set the house on fire and soon wanted to confess everything to the police as he had confessed to her. Thanks to the pager messages and the suspect's statements, investigators established the details of the kidnapping and the crime. Thus, it was found that 4 men were involved: Joshua Torres, Julio Negrin, Jose Negrin, Julio's namesake, and Nicholas Brett, nicknamed Jay. Notably, Julio dated Kimberly for a while and even wanted to marry her, but she rejected his proposal. The young people were united by the fact that they were friends and had a criminal past behind them. However, it did not compare to what the guys did to the poor girl. Nicholas had been released on bail shortly before the kidnapping. Thanks to his mother, he got off with a small fine for a crime that could have sentenced him to more than a year in prison. As for Joshua, at a young age he was involved in cases of child abduction, violence against a minor, illegal carrying of weapons. However, he too was limited to a light sentence for the acts committed. The initiator of the crime was undoubtedly him. It was Joshua who coordinated the group's actions. After Kimberly returned from the party, the men grabbed her in the parking lot. Apparently, they'd been following her and waiting for the perfect moment to leave her alone. A gun was used for intimidation. Kim resisted, so her hands were tied and her mouth, eyes, and even ears were covered with duct tape. After that, the bandits put the girl in the trunk and drove her to an abandoned house. There, they took the unfortunate woman to the basement and tied her to a chair. They even removed her shoes so that she would not attract attention to herself by tapping her feet. Before this, the young men told Kimberly that her father owed money and they would release her after he had paid them. Julio was supposed to look after the girl, bring her food and water twice a day, and make sure she was warm. However, he was afraid of the consequences and left the house. As it happened, the victim did not eat or drink for 3 days and also froze from the cold. As soon as the abductee was left alone, the perpetrators informed Joshua. He made an audio recording in which he demanded $75,000 as ransom. Then the guy called the girl's father and left 2 messages, which later turned out to be empty, so they were not taken into account by Mr. Antonakis. The kidnappers waited for news and sincerely did not understand why Kim's father did not get in touch with them. During this time, Kimberly, left unattended, passed out from dehydration more than once, but she was still fighting for life. The intruders were angry that they had not received the ransom and they were afraid of being caught, so they decided to let her go. When they went down to the basement, they found the girl unconscious. Deciding that Kimberly was dead, they thought of nothing better than to get rid of all the evidence and at the same time of the hostage. In talking to Liz, the officers discovered that Joshua had used his roommate as an alibi. He directed the actions of the accomplices while in the house with the child. Liz claimed that at first she did not even realize that her boyfriend had kidnapped Kimberly. Later at trial, Liz testified against him. She said that after the interrogation, Joshua came to her and confessed to everything. After that, he beat her and silenced her, threatened to kill her, and soon went on the run. Sometime later, the perpetrator was arrested. He was also suspected of killing Jose. However, there was no direct evidence of this. Investigators decided to confront the former friends. They informed them that Joshua denied his involvement in the massacre. When Julio learned about it, he cooperated with the investigation and told everything. This allowed Torres to be convicted of Kimberly's murder. As a result, the trio was charged with murder, arson, kidnapping, and holding a person against his will. During the trial, it was found that Joshua had repeatedly tried to mislead the investigation and avoid punishment. The jury deliberated for about 10 hours. In the end, Joshua Torres was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Nicholas Brett received the same sentence. Julio Negrin was only found guilty of accessory after the fact. As such, he was sentenced to between 2 and 6 years in prison. Tomas Antonakis was satisfied with the verdict of the court. He did not want the criminals to be sentenced to death. In his opinion, it would have been the lightest punishment. It is known that Nicholas was repeatedly abused and assaulted in prison, and after 2 years in prison, he died of AIDS. Julio was released after 2 years, having served his sentence. Joshua will not be released until 2053 at the earliest, if he lives to see it. Sadly, in 2005, the victim's father died of cancer. His family is sure that the disease provoked the terrible death of his daughter. This is how unexpectedly cut short the life of a beautiful girl, Kimberly Antonakis. Whether excessive good-naturedness the cause of her premature departure, it is difficult to judge. However, if she had been more prudent and choosy in her surroundings, perhaps she would have lived a long and happy life. Good always triumphs over evil, even in a case like this. The trial that took place and life afterward set things right. The perpetrators of the tragedy are severely punished and are unlikely to ever forget what they have done. As the rain falls and the night deepens, thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.